with an estimated birth year yielded predictable results: charity events, fashion shows, glowing profiles in luxury magazines. It was a digital smokescreen, a carefully constructed narrative. So she changed her tactics. She began searching for Alistair Sterling, focusing on news archives from before his rise to prominence. He was a ruthless, ambitious developer, but his early years were shrouded in a surprising amount of obscurity. He had appeared on the San Francisco scene seemingly out of nowhere, a man with a Midas touch and a mysterious past. Clara started digging into old property records, business filings, anything that could shed light on Alistair's origins. For days she hit nothing but dead ends, and then she found it. Tucked away in the digital archives of a small local newspaper from a dusty, forgotten town in the Nevada desert was a brief article from the late 1980s about a contentious zoning dispute. A small family-owned diner was being forced out to make way for a new development project. The developer's name was Alistair Sterling. The article was unremarkable, except for one small detail. It mentioned Alistair's family, his wife, who had passed away years earlier, and his young daughter. The daughter's name was not Victoria, it was Chastity. Chastity Sterling. Clara felt a jolt of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of an archivist on the verge of a breakthrough. She ran a new search, this time for Chastity Sterling, and the results, though sparse, began to paint a very different picture. A few mentions in the local Nevada paper, a high school honor roll, a win at a county fair pie-eating contest, and then the digital Rosetta Stone. It was a link to a grainy, low-quality video on a forgotten video-sharing platform. The video was from a local access cable channel in Nevada, a broadcast of a small-town beauty pageant from the early 1990s. The pageant's theme was Silver State Sweethearts. Clara's hands trembled as she clicked play. And there she was, a much younger, much less polished version of Victoria Sterling. Her hair was a brassy, over-teased blonde, not the sophisticated raven black. She wore a cheap sequin dress and a forced, desperate smile. But the bone structure was the same. The sharp jawline, the high cheekbones, and the eyes, not violet, but a pale, hard blue filled with a fierce, almost desperate ambition. The announcer's voice, tinny and distorted, boomed through the laptop speakers. And now, giving us her rendition of God Bless America, is contestant number 7, the lovely Chastity Sterling. The girl on the screen opened her mouth and a reedy, off-key voice filled the air. But it wasn't the singing that made Clara's breath catch. It was the interview portion that followed. "So, Chastity," the host said, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" The young woman's face hardened, her smile tightening. "I'm going to be rich," she said, her voice a flat, hard drawl, a world away from the clipped, vaguely European accent Victoria used now. "Richer than all of you. And I'm going to get out of this town, and I am never ever coming back." Clara leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. The lioness of the Azure Point, the queen of San Francisco society, had a skeleton in her closet. And that skeleton was a small-town beauty queen named Chastity, with a bad singing voice and a heart full of rage. The carefully constructed world of Victoria Sterling was a lie, a multi-million-dollar effort to bury the ghost of Chastity. The whispers in the restaurant were nothing. Clara had just found the name that Victoria Sterling had tried to bury forever. The discovery of Chastity Sterling changed everything for Clara, but she knew that knowledge was a weapon that had to be wielded with precision. A direct confrontation would be a fool's errand. For now, she held the secret close, a hidden ace in the starched pocket of her uniform. Her continued composure, however, was having an unnerving effect on Victoria. Clara's refusal to be baited was a constant, low-grade irritant, a grain of sand in the perfectly oiled machine of her dominance. If she couldn't break the new waitress with psychological warfare, she would have to escalate. She would have to destroy her. The attack came on a balmy Saturday evening, when the Azure Point was at its glittering, chaotic peak. Victoria was at her usual table, holding court for a group of equally wealthy and influential friends. She was the picture of charm and grace, but Clara, now attuned to the subtle tells, could see the tension in her jaw, the way her violet eyes kept flicking towards her. She was a panther in the tall grass, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The moment came after the main course plates had been cleared. Victoria let out a small, perfectly timed gasp, bringing a hand to her throat, her diamond-encrusted fingers fluttering against her skin. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of shock and panic. "It's gone." Her friends turned to her, their faces etched with concern. "What's gone, darling?" One of them, a woman named Beatrice, asked. "My necklace," Victoria exclaimed, her voice rising just enough to cut through the dining room's ambient hum. "The sterling sapphire. My father gave it to me for my 30th birthday. It's gone." A wave of hushed whispers spread from their table. The sterling sapphire was a legendary piece of jewelry, a massive cornflower blue gem, rumored to be worth more than a fleet of luxury cars. Victoria stood up, her face a mask of frantic disbelief. "It was here just a moment ago. I remember fidgeting with it right before the waitress cleared my plate." Her eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, locked onto Clara. "You, the waitress. You were the last one at this table. You leaned over me when you took my friend's plate." The accusation, as devastating as it was predictable, hung in the air. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her, but her archival training, the discipline of staying calm and methodical in the face of chaos, took over. "Stay calm. Observe. Do not react." "Mrs. Sterling," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding in her chest, "I assure you, I didn't see a necklace." "Of course you would say that," Beatrice chimed in, eager to play her part in the drama. "It could have fallen onto the plate, and you just whisked it away with the scraps." Mr. Dubois rushed over, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Miss Sterling, what seems to be the trouble?" "The trouble, Dubois," Victoria said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Clara, "is that my necklace, a piece of jewelry worth a small fortune, has vanished, and your waitress here was the last person near me. I want her searched. I want the kitchen searched. I want that necklace found." This was the checkmate, a public branding. In this rarefied world, the word of Victoria Sterling against that of a waitress was an open and shut case. Clara would be fired, her reputation shattered. The accusation of theft, even if unproven, would be a permanent stain, a professional death sentence. Mr. Dubois looked at Clara, his eyes a mixture of pity and pleading. "Clara May, did you see anything at all?" "No, sir," Clara said firmly. "I cleared the plates and took them directly to the kitchen." "Search her pockets," Beatrice demanded. "That won't be necessary," Clara said, her voice cutting through the rising tide of hysteria. She looked Mr. Dubois in the eye. "I will happily empty my pockets. I have nothing to hide." She calmly took out her server's notepad, a pen, and a tube of hand lotion, placing them on a nearby service stand for all to see. Victoria scoffed. "As if you'd keep it in your pocket. It's probably in the kitchen, stashed in a bin, waiting for you to retrieve it at the end of your shift." The trap was as brilliant as it was cruel. The necklace was most likely nestled safely in the silk lining of Victoria's own clutch, waiting to be discovered later, after Clara's life had been thoroughly and irrevocably ruined. An accusation was all that was needed. "We will, of course, search the kitchen," Mr. Dubois stammered, trying to placate her. "And what about her?" Victoria insisted, her voice rising to a shrill, theatrical pitch. "She should be detained. We should call the police." The staff began a frantic, humiliating search, on their hands and knees peering under tables. Clara stood still, the silent, accused eye of the hurricane. She knew she was being framed. She knew that denials were futile. She had to change the narrative. She had to use the one weapon Victoria didn't know she possessed: knowledge. This was the moment, not to drop a bomb, but to plant a seed of doubt, to introduce an element of chaos into Victoria's perfectly staged drama. As the fruitless search continued, a suffocating sense of doom settled over Clara. Mr. Dubois was wringing his hands. Victoria was looking triumphant. "We can't find anything, Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Dubois reported, his voice shaky. "Then call the police," Victoria commanded. "I want to file a report." The word report hung in the air, a final damning verdict. Clara knew this was her last chance. She couldn't prove her innocence regarding the necklace, because the necklace's location was part of the lie. but she could attack the credibility of her accuser. She took a deep breath and looked directly at Victoria. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried an unusual weight. Ms. Sterling, perhaps you should check your clutch again. Sometimes when things are stressful, we misplace things. Victoria laughed, a short, ugly sound. Are you suggesting I'm being forgetful? I think not. Not at all, Clara said, her tone still perfectly even. It's just that high-stress situations can be disorienting. They can make you feel like you're in a different time, a different place. She paused for a beat, letting the words hang in the air. A place with a lot of dust and silver state pageants, for instance. The words dropped into the charged atmosphere of the restaurant with the force of a physical blow. They were so specific, so utterly out of place that they created a moment of pure, unadulterated confusion. Victoria's friends looked puzzled. Mr. Dubois frowned. But Victoria froze. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the elegant, wrong socialite slipped. A flicker of raw, primal fear flashed in her eyes. It was the look of a cornered animal. Her face, which had been flushed with righteous anger, turned a deathly pale. What did you say? She stammered, her voice losing its imperious edge. Clara held her gaze, her expression a perfect blank. I said things can be disorienting, she repeated softly. My apologies if I misspoke. But the damage was done. The surgical strike had hit its mark. Clara hadn't accused her of anything. She had simply painted a tiny, vivid picture, a picture that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, but meant everything to Victoria. It was a signal, a quiet, devastating whisper. I know. The shift in Victoria's demeanor was palpable. Her confidence wavered. The righteous fury that had been her shield now seemed brittle. She had lost control of the narrative. Sensing his friend's sudden distress, one of the men at the table stood up. All right, this has gone on long enough. Victoria, let's just go. We'll deal with the insurance company for the necklace. No, Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She was rattled, her mind clearly racing to understand how this waitress, this nobody, could possibly know. It was then that Clara played her final card. It was a gamble, a piece of psychological theater based on a hunch about human nature and the vanity of a woman like Victoria. Ms. Sterling, Clara said, her voice still calm and reasonable, before you go, perhaps you could check the small silk pocket on the inside of your wrap. Sometimes a clasp can come undone, and a heavy pendant can slip into an unexpected place. Victoria shot Clara a look of pure venom. She knew what was happening. Clara was offering her an out, an escape route, but an escape route that would make her look utterly, laughably foolish. It was a checkmate. If the necklace was found on her person, the entire elaborate scene she had created would collapse into a ridiculous, hysterical farce. Hesitantly, Beatrice, her friend, reached for Victoria's cashmere wrap, which was draped over the back of her chair. Well, it's worth a look, I suppose, she said, her voice uncertain. Beatrice's fingers fumbled with the wrap, and then her expression shifted from confusion to surprise. Her fingers closed around a small, hard object. She pulled it out. There, glittering under the soft, expensive lighting of the azure point, was the sterling sapphire, its deep blue catching the light like a captured piece of the twilight sky. A collective gasp went through the room. Well, I'll be, Beatrice muttered, staring at the necklace. It must have come unclasped and fallen right into your wrap. She looked at her friend, a hint of annoyance now coloring her tone. All this fuss, Victoria, and it was here the whole time. The humiliation was instantaneous and complete. Victoria's face went from pale to a deep mottled red. She had accused a waitress of grand theft, demanded a police investigation, and held the entire restaurant hostage, only for the missing item to be found in her own wrap. She didn't look like a powerful victim. She looked like a fool, a hysterical, paranoid, wealthy woman who had misplaced her necklace and thrown a childish tantrum. Her friends suddenly found the patterns on their plates intensely fascinating. The whispers around the room were no longer of theft, but of ridicule. Without another word, Victoria snatched the necklace from Beatrice's hand, grabbed her clutch, and stormed out of the restaurant, her head held high, but her entire posture screaming defeat. Her friends were left to settle the bill, their faces a mask of weary apology, leaving a crater of social embarrassment in their wake. Mr. Dubois looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. He didn't understand what had just happened, not really, but he knew that Clara had somehow faced down the lioness in her own den, and, against all odds, won. Clara took a steadying breath, her adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. She hadn't exposed Chastity Sterling. She hadn't needed to. She had simply used a few carefully chosen words to unravel the thread of Victoria's composure, making her look not just cruel, but utterly, laughably ridiculous. And in Victoria Sterling's world, being ridiculous was a fate far worse than being feared. The fallout from the necklace incident was immediate and profound. Overnight, the atmosphere at the Azure Point shifted. The staff no longer looked at Clara with pity, but with a kind of bewildered reverence. She was the woman who had made the Queen look like a court jester. The fear of Victoria Sterling hadn't vanished, but it was now laced with a delicious, liberating element of mockery. Victoria, predictably, did not return the following Thursday, or the Thursday after that. Her absence was a palpable relief, the lifting of a long, oppressive siege. But Clara knew it wasn't over. A woman like Victoria Sterling didn't just accept humiliation. She would be plotting her revenge, something more permanent and destructive than a public tantrum. Clara knew she had to arm herself for the final confrontation. It was time to fully resurrect the ghost of Chastity Sterling. Her first step was to find a primary source, someone who knew Chastity before she had buried herself under layers of sterling wealth and a new identity. The small-town Nevada newspaper archives were a start, but they were a cold, impersonal record. Clara needed a human connection. She found a promising lead in a high school yearbook she'd managed to access through an online genealogy database. Under Chastity Sterling's senior picture, there was a list of extracurricular activities, including the Future Homemakers of America Club. The club's faculty advisor was a woman named Eleanor Vance. A quick search revealed that Eleanor Vance, now in her late 60s, was still living in the same small Nevada town, retired after a 40-year career as a home economics teacher. It was a long shot, but Clara composed a carefully worded email introducing herself as a freelance writer working on a story about the changing face of the American West and how the lives of young women in small towns had evolved over the past few decades. She mentioned that she'd come across Chastity Sterling's name in her research and would love to hear any memories Mrs. Vance might have of a former student. For 2 days, there was no reply. Clara started to think it was a dead end. Then, an email notification popped up. It was from Eleanor Vance. "Dear Ms. Thompson," the email began, "I remember Chastity Sterling very well. A very driven young woman. If you're ever in our neck of the woods, I'd be happy to chat over a cup of tea." 2 days later, Clara was driving her beat-up sedan through the vast, empty expanse of the Nevada desert, the shimmering heat a world away from the cool, foggy streets of San Francisco. She found Eleanor Vance in a small, tidy house with a garden full of resilient desert roses. Over iced tea and homemade shortbread cookies, Eleanor painted a vivid and often poignant picture of the girl who would become Victoria Sterling. "Chastity was a girl in a hurry," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with a sad, gentle wisdom. "Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father, Alistair, was always working, always scheming. He was a hard man, obsessed with making money, with escaping his own humble beginnings, and he poured all of that ambition, all of that shame into his daughter." She described a young girl who was relentlessly drilled on etiquette, who was forced to take voice and deportment lessons, who was constantly told that her small-town roots were something to be ashamed of, something to be erased. She was fiercely ambitious, yes, Eleanor continued, but she was also deeply, deeply insecure. She believed that the only way to be loved, the only way to be safe, was to be perfect, to be powerful, to be someone else entirely. The beauty pageants, the desperate attempts at sophistication, it was all part of Alistair's grand plan to mold his daughter into a suitable heiress for the empire he was determined to build. "Is there anything else?" Clara asked, sensing there was more to the story. "Any specific event she'd be terrified of people knowing?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. There is one thing, she said slowly. Her senior year, there was a scandal. A boy in her class, a sweet kid from a poor family, had a crush on her. He wrote her a poem. It was clumsy, heartfelt,